surrogacy industry has become a multi-billion-dollar trade. Celebrities like Elton John, Kim Kardashian, Kanye West, Paris Hilton have all had their babies through surrogacy. But what are the darker sides to the surrogacy trade? To discuss this, I'm joined by author and writer Julie Bindel and former Conservative MP Miriam Cates. Miriam, I'd like to start with you first. You have spoken openly against surrogacy. Could you tell us what your concerns are?
Yes, I think surrogacy is something I'd never really thought much about until I started getting into the birth rate debate and about how Britain needs more children as well as the whole of the Western world. And people started suggesting that fertility treatments could be the answer to this. I mean, by the way, that they're not. They just never, they're not scalable. So we park that. But it made me start to think about surrogacy. And somebody pointed out to me that in the UK, it's actually illegal to sell a puppy before it's weaned. And I think most people would have a gut reaction to taking a puppy off its mother the minute it's born, not letting it be fed, not letting it be nurtured. And yet, essentially, that's what surrogacy does. It deliberately brings a child into the world for the express purpose of taking it off its mother at birth. And if in the UK we think that's absolutely immoral and unethical when it comes to puppies, how can we possibly support it when it comes to babies? And I think, unfortunately, too often this debate, as in so many others, and the gender debate, which I know Julie's involved in as well, is another one of these, it's all focused around adult rights. And does a particular adult, a single man, have the rights to become a parent? Now, we can all argue that it's a good thing to become a parent and feel very compassionate towards people who, for whatever reason, can't become parents, of course. But that's different to saying that there is a right to become a parent. And if you do have a right to become a parent, then surely a baby has a right to its mother in the way that a puppy does. So I think seeing this through the lens of individual adult rights is not helpful. And actually, a better lens to look at it is our duty to protect the vulnerable. And of course, the most vulnerable people in this situation are the babies. The second most vulnerable people are the surrogate mothers. And they both get a very, very raw deal out of surrogacy. So I think we need a different language, a different philosophical framework to talk about things like surrogacy, because individual competing adult rights just doesn't cut it.
And Julie, you wrote a huge investigation for the Telegraph in early August about the surrogacy industry worldwide. What did you learn?
Well, we unearthed big pregnancy, big fertility. It's a business. And I know that people, particularly well meaning people in the UK where commercial surrogacy isn't legal or not quite legal, think that it's about altruism, about big hearted women wishing to give the gift of carrying a child for an infertile couple or a single person. And in fact, these days, that includes, of course, gay men and single heterosexual men. And that all you see at the end is a happy, smiling baby. Everybody's happy because the surrogate has done the kindest, nicest thing imaginable. In reality, the global market is already worth almost £14 billion worldwide, and it's projected to rise to £100 billion in 2023. In other words, there's lots of money to be made. Now, what people will tell you in the UK, and there's a big push, as Miriam, I'm sure, will be able to explain, towards commercial surrogacy, towards commercial advertising, the kind of wild west of the industry. What they will tell you is that there's no such thing as commercial surrogacy here because surrogates will be paid reasonable expenses. But that ranges from £14,000 for the pregnancy through to 30 odd £1,000. And who knows what's in the brown envelope once it's handed over. There's no regulating this at all. So in fact, commercial surrogacy is here. Brokers can send and divert and signpost individuals who wish to have commercial surrogacy to all kinds of different countries and clinics and the like, where they will be taken care of. And there's a huge amount of money to be made, including in the UK. So that's what we found. And we found that there is practices worldwide that many people who profit from surrogacy are pushing to have here, which is sex selection. And we know that's illegal in the UK and many other countries, and we know why. And also deals such as, two for the price of one, all kinds of medical procedures and the like.
2 for the price of 1 babies.
Well, 2 implants for the price of 1, the option of sex selection, and a pay-as-you-go plan. I mean, there's some of the deals on offer. And when you think about cosmetic surgery here in the UK, the way that plastic surgeons are regulated so that they don't kind of, I suppose, groom or target vulnerable people who are likely to part with a lot of money that they can't afford to have procedures that they really shouldn't have, is that they are told that they can't offer 2 for the price of 1. In other words, if you're going to have a birthmark removed from your face, you can't then be offered half price breast enlargement, because they know that once people get into the kind of swing of this, that they're more likely to spend money and be more likely to part with their cash to sharks and other people without morals and ethics. And the surrogacy market is full of people without morals and ethics, and it's full of vulnerable women, both the surrogate mothers, the egg donors who effectively sell their eggs through desperation, and let's not forget the babies born of surrogacy.
Julie, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the surrogacy trade is different in Britain. In Britain, it's called altruistic surrogacy, whereas in places like America and Canada, it's seen as a commercial trade.
Well, in New York State, for example, which I think it was 2 years ago, maybe a little longer, it legalized commercial surrogacy, which means that you can advertise on subways, you can advertise on billboards, you can advertise in Craigslist, on Facebook pages, and say, please give your eggs, we'll buy your eggs from you. Women, if you've already had a pregnancy and you're over this age, which is getting younger and younger, we will pay you to have a baby for someone else, the gift of life, or however euphemistically they put it. And so it's full throttle commercial. You go into the clinic, which I did, this particular one in New York, where they are talking about the women who are going to bear these children as though they are microwave ovens, as though they're subhuman, and that what you're going to get at the end is a baby that's never belonged to her, but that belongs to what they call the commissioning parents. And so therefore the baby is sold, it's taken from its mother for a price and sold to the commissioning parents. So that's full throttle commercial surrogacy. Now, what we've got in the UK, where commercial surrogacy is banned, but international imports are not. So in other words, you can import fertilized, embryos, you can import sperm, you can import the surrogate mothers, you can have deals with intended parents that are brokered in the UK for a price, where they send these intended parents to places such as New York, or if they want a cheaper deal, India, Mexico, Ukraine. And there are now between 400 and 500 new surrogate incubated babies registered each year. And in the 10 years up to 2022, the UK surrogate market increased by 283%. But
Wow.
it's illegal to advertise if you're looking for a surrogate in the UK, or to solicit for business if you want to become a surrogate. And remember, these women do this because they are desperate. It's also an offence to arrange or negotiate a surrogacy arrangement as a commercial enterprise. But that doesn't really matter because, as I said earlier, reasonable expenses can stretch way beyond the average annual wage.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you're enjoying the show, why not subscribe to The Spectator? In September, you can get 3 months of website and app access absolutely free. Follow the Tory leadership campaign, Labour's inaugural budget and the US elections with Britain's best informed journalists. And get your first 3 months free, only in September. Go to www.spectator.co.uk/The TV offer.
So, do you think that if it's if a surrogate mother has a child for another couple, but they have a system where the mother is involved in the baby's life for a very long time, you're not actually taking the baby away from this mother. Would that be suitable to you?
Well, I think, like with anything, there are different degrees of harm, aren't there? There are surrogate mothers in developing countries who are absolutely being exploited. There are probably women in more developed, wealthier countries that do think they're doing this out of free will and may well be consenting. But that doesn't make any difference really to the baby. Yes, of course, if their mother is involved in their life and they have access to their genetic history, that's obviously better than not knowing anything about their family. But it's still not the same as having the nurture and the physical care of the mother, particularly in those early weeks and months. And we know so much now about attachment theory, about how when the baby is born, it already is familiar with its mother's voice, with its mother's tastes, how important it is then to be breastfed and have masses of physical contact with its mother. And even if the mother is seen once a month or once a week, that isn't the same as if she is herself caring for that child. And we go to great lengths to avoid taking children off their biological parents. Social services try everything else first because we know how important that natural bond is. And yet surrogacy is deliberately designed to break that natural and, I believe, sacred bond at birth. And Julie referred to the rules in this country. And unfortunately, there is a push from the Law Commission, actually, bizarrely, who aren't really supposed to recommend changes in such a political way, to liberalise the law further. And it would actually take away any rights that surrogate mothers do have, and could end up with the mother not even being named on the birth certificate, even if she's donated her own eggs and therefore is the biological as well as the gestational mother. So I don't think that's progress for women or children. And as you said, Julia, that would make us a complete outlier with all other countries in Western Europe.
Yeah, and Julie, there was a story last week actually about a surrogate mother that had been blocked from seeing the child by a gay couple. I don't know if you were across this story.
Yeah, well, Natasha, can I just say that actually was my story that the Daily Mail then took from the issue of the Critic magazine that I had written back in April, and it was published the month after in the Critic, and I was in the family court reporting on that case, and I was the very first person to report on that case. And someone obviously saw that story and wrote it up in the Mail as an exclusive, which was quite outrageous. So I am very familiar with the story. I've interviewed the surrogate mother. As I say, I was there during the proceedings. I then wrote up a big feature on it. And in fact, if you fancy putting it in the show notes, I can send you the link. And what was really shocking about this was the way that this gay male couple, who had entered into an informal relationship with this woman who was doing it for all of the kind, good, altruistic reasons, then treated her like she didn't exist, like she didn't matter, and in fact accused her of homophobia when she said that the child needed contact with his mother. Now, actually, at that stage, the mother had agreed that these men could have parental responsibility, which is a legal term, but she had been told by them that she could have regular contact with him, including on his birthday. They then froze her out, and she then started to regret signing that parental order and wanted to keep those rights for herself. And the court case was about her going back and saying she wasn't in the right state when she signed that order. She was vulnerable. She felt bullied. She didn't know she had the right to not sign it. And in a very interesting legal move, the judge reversed that order. And so she remains legally attached as a parent to that child. The child still lives with the gay male couple. And let's see whether or not they then do the same again by refusing to let her see the child. Now, this happens all the time, but many women, most women in this situation, don't then take legal action. It's a horrific thing to have to go through this, go to the family court and the like when you're arguing over a child. I don't think that anyone has the right to a child. I really don't. I think there are many people who desperately want children. That's a different issue. I don't think anyone has the right to a child. That's the wrong language and the wrong way to look at it. And also, as Miriam pointed out, there are degrees of harm. And of course, refusing to allow a child to see the surrogate mother at all or give any information to the child is even worse. But I think where the harm lies is that child growing up knowing that it was sold. That it was sold for whatever reason, however desperate that child's mother was, that baby was sold and it was bought. And the harm is just, it's so significant. We have spoken with people who are now adults that have grown up, who were born of surrogacy, who are now speaking out, thankfully, and are making sure that people realise this is not victimless and children do suffer, not just the surrogate mothers.
Julie, I want to ask you about abortion, because I think that lots of feminists would, I'm thinking a lot about the term my body, my choice. And some of the things we've been talking about in the office is some people would say, well, if it's a woman's body and she should have the right to have an abortion, why should she not be able to make these decisions about her body, such as becoming a surrogate mother? And I believe you're pro-abortion. So why is this different?
Well, first of all, I think you'd have to be quite sociopathic to be pro-abortion. I'm pro a woman's choice to have an abortion through, her own reasoning, a free and legal abortion, and that right has to be indivisible. When we hear about the rights of women to use their bodies for surrogacy, we also hear that argument, which is a pro-prostitution argument. So, of course, that how dare you say that the global sex trade is an abomination? You're taking away the rights of women to use their bodies however they wish. But with an abortion, this is something that women do because it would be worse for them. The alternative of carrying that child, for whatever reason, would be far worse than having the baby. So it's something that she does for herself because she is unable to go through with the pregnancy. With surrogacy, she is being exploited and abused for third parties. With prostitution, she's being exploited, harmed, and abused for third parties. So it's an entirely different issue. It's the opposite. And this idea that a woman's right to choose can be extended to terrible things that men do to those bodies for their benefit, and then to turn it back on women is quite scandalous. And of course, with surrogacy, often the exploiter is another woman. And I've heard terrible stories about women who just don't want to carry a baby because she'll get stretch marks. She won't be able to go on a particular adventurous holiday she wanted to go on. She basically can't be bothered to give birth. But the majority of people who are taking up surrogacy services these days, in other words, where we're seeing the increase, are those that just have decided they wish to have a baby as a fashion accessory because they think they have the right to one and because they now can.
Miriam, there are two types of surrogacy, because obviously I was reading into Julie's investigation. You have traditional surrogacy, and then you can have gestational surrogacy. And with gestational surrogacy, you have a different embryo implanted into the carrying mother's womb. One of the things I found really interesting was actually there's a lot of health implications that can come from that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, there are always going to be implications when you depart from the natural order of things, which is to have two biological parents. Essentially, if you have three biological parents, there are going to be all sorts of complications, such as you don't know the genetic history necessarily of all your parents. There are also some indications that freezing eggs and freezing embryos may create children who have more or are more likely to have health problems in the long term. I don't think that's particularly thoroughly researched yet, so that would apply too. But I think this assumption that a surrogate mother who is not using her own eggs is simply just some sort of vehicle with no connection to the baby, it is false. And we do know that the cells of the baby are now circulate in the mother's body for perhaps a couple of decades after the baby's born. So even if that baby is not the genetic child of the surrogate mother, there is still a deep biological connection between the two that is not broken just because the baby is taken away. So there are all sorts of biological and ethical implications for everybody involved. And of course, Julie referred to egg donors earlier on. The process of donating eggs or having eggs harvested is horrific and very, very risky. And of course, it's one thing if you are doing it to have IVF yourself, to get to become a mother, to bring up your own child. But if you're doing that essentially because you feel forced to for the money, then the risks that a woman has to undergo in order to have those eggs harvested are quite severe. So the further you go out along the web of who is affected in surrogacy, the worse it gets. But I think again, the individual rights framework just isn't sufficient to discuss the ethics of this. And we do have to look much more closely at the kind of societal duty to protect babies and the common good argument of, well, if you did allow surrogacy, there certainly would be an individual benefit for some people who are infertile, who desperately want children. But there's a definite common good argument against legalizing it because of the huge numbers of babies and women who would be harmed as a result.
Yeah, but Miriam, just back on the topic of gay couples that want to have children, is it not more important about how a child is raised rather than how the child is birthed? And in a lot of cases, gay couples, they could come from a two-income family, they could be able to look after a child in a way that, as many cases, a single parent might not be able to. And I just wonder if there's so much focus on how you give birth to the child, but actually if it's raised in a very loving, happy family, then surely that it's worth that process.
Well, obviously, if a child is raised in a loving, happy family, that's better than them being raised in an unloving, unhappy family, of course. But I think they're separate arguments because the question we're asking is it morally right to bring a child into the world with the express purpose of taking it off its mother at birth? Now, if that child has to be taken off its mother at birth for other reasons, the mother is just not capable of looking after the child, then of course the next best option is to be brought up in a loving family that's financially stable, that can offer love, of course. But that's a different moral question. We are asking whether it's okay to bring a child into the world with the express purpose of not having a mother. And I would say that, no, that's not moral. That's deeply unethical. We don't do it to puppies, and therefore we shouldn't do it to babies. But of course, adoption, and if babies are put up for adoption because there's no other option, then of course that is a different question about who is the best parent and who is the second best to look after the child after being fortunate enough to have biological parents. So I think we can't confuse the two moral issues, but it comes back to, is there a right to become a parent? And if there is a right to become a parent, then someone somewhere has a duty to supply a baby, and that becomes very dangerous. And actually, we've seen something, a little of this in Scotland, where I think, and Julie will probably know more about this, where the SNP government I think promised that if couples could provide a surrogate, the government or the Scottish NHS would provide an egg. But then, of course, the government has a duty to harvest eggs. And how are they going to achieve that ethically without advertising and offering money to vulnerable young women? So we very, very quickly get into serious ethical dangers when we start to think that parenting is a right rather than a privilege and a blessing as it used to be seen, and something that you just can't guarantee. Like, you can't guarantee that you're going to have a long life. You can't guarantee that you're going to have a happy marriage. You can't guarantee health. Those are the kind of things that perhaps in previous generations people would have put down to luck or providence. But now, in a very much an individualistic, rights-based society, we somehow think we have a right to.
Lastly, Julie, I just want to ask about having done your investigation and spoken to so many surrogate mothers and parents who decided to have a child through surrogacy. Do you think that they had enough information about health implications, legal issues, or do you think they sort of went in blind into the process? They had enough money to buy a child, to buy a baby, and they were unaware of quite how terrible it can be in some cases?
I have met individuals, including at least 2 gay men in different countries, who have since looked again at the choices that they made in entering this commercial enterprise. In other words, buying a baby, which is what it is. It's buying a baby, and have since learned a lot that they didn't want to see at the time. about the way that the surrogate mothers are treated. For example, one gay man who went to India to buy a baby hadn't realised, because he hadn't looked hard enough, that these women are made to sleep in a room with 10 other surrogates, are told what to eat and drink, forbidden from eating certain things, told when to drink, to take their medication. They're not allowed to ride a bike. They're not allowed to have sex with their husbands. I mean, all kinds of things that they have to sign a contract pledging to do or not to do. And many of these women are illiterate. And then there are, of course, the women who have a terrible psychological harm because they have bonded with the fetus and during the pregnancy have decided that they had changed their mind. They didn't want to part with the baby. And because of the law in that country with commercial surrogacy, they were obliged to part with the baby. So I have met people who've looked at that again, but I think that they chose not to look into it at the time because the information is all there. And quite frankly, you should know. It doesn't take an awful lot of brains or nous to think about the fact that renting a womb or borrowing the womb off a woman who is then going to hand over a baby would be harmful in a number of respects and risky in a number of other respects. I mean, Miriam spoke about the health effects. What people don't seem to recognise is that, for example, implanting an embryo that has no biological relationship to the surrogate mother can often be rejected in a way that giving somebody a new kidney would be rejected. The health implications are terrible, and many of these women sign contracts that say that selected abortion can happen without her consent or even knowledge half of the time if it's a multiple pregnancy or even a single pregnancy and the fetus is not viable, quote unquote. So I think that people should take a very long, hard look at what the industry is and who the surrogate women are before they enter this. But quite frankly, and I hate to say this, but most of them will not care, or they wouldn't have gone down this route at all.
Julie Bindel and Miriam Cates, thanks for joining us on Spectator TV.